I never imagined that something as ordinary as a chair in a neighborhood cafe could become the center of a police report. But that's the strange thing about routines. When you repeat them quietly and consistently, someone eventually decides they mean something they don't. For me, that routine began with a small cafe on Maple Street, the kind of place people drift into without thinking, drawn by the smell of fresh coffee and the low murmur of conversation. That feels safer than silence, and every morning before work I would step inside, order the same drink, and sit in the same seat by the window without giving it any deeper meaning than comfort and habit. The seat itself wasn't special in any grand sense, just a wooden chair slightly uneven at one leg, paired with a small square table positioned close enough to the window that sunlight spilled across it in the early hours, warming the surface and making the steam from my coffee curl upward in a way that always felt calm and familiar. From that spot, I could see the street come alive in stages, delivery trucks arriving too early, joggers slowing to a walk, shop owners unlocking doors, and commuters staring into their phones as if the world might disappear if they looked up. And that quiet observation became the mental buffer between my private life and the responsibilities waiting for me at work. I was never the only regular there, and that was part of what made the cafe feel real rather than staged. Because there was the older man who read the newspaper cover to cover every morning, the woman who always ordered tea and graded papers with a red pen, and the couple who shared one pastry and whispered like they were telling secrets even though they'd probably been married for decades. No one claimed ownership over the space, and yet everyone had their unspoken place within it, moving around each other with the kind of casual respect that comes from sharing a routine, without needing to acknowledge it. For the first few months, nothing disrupted that balance, and then one morning, a woman walked in who didn't blend into the room the way everyone else did, not because she looked unusual, but because she moved like the space owed her something. Her heels struck the floor sharply, her posture was rigid and alert, as she scanned the cafe the way someone scans a hotel lobby after a long flight, clearly expecting something specific and growing irritated when it doesn't immediately present itself. At first, she didn't pay attention to me at all, choosing a table near the counter and spending most of her time on her phone. But after a few days, I noticed her gaze drifting toward my seat by the window, lingering longer each time as if she were measuring the distance between expectation and reality. I told myself it was nothing, because people look around cafes all the time, and there was no reason to assume I was suddenly the focus of someone else's dissatisfaction. That illusion didn't last long. One morning, as I was settling into my chair and opening my laptop, she approached my table without warning, standing close enough that her shadow fell across my screen, and in a voice that was sharp but controlled, she said, "Do you always sit there?" As if the answer might somehow justify what she was about to say next. I looked up, surprised by the directness, and replied honestly that I came most mornings and liked the seat because of the light, expecting that to be the end of it. Instead, she frowned and said, "That's not really fair to everyone else, is it?" Glancing around the cafe as if she were representing an unseen group of wronged patrons, I looked around too, noticing at least 5 empty tables, and gently pointed that out, hoping logic would settle whatever unspoken grievance had formed in her mind. But she only shook her head and muttered something about entitlement before walking away. Over the next week, her behavior escalated in small but unmistakable ways, with loud sighs whenever she passed my table, pointed comments about people who camp out in public spaces, and exaggerated movements whenever she sat down elsewhere, as if the act of choosing another chair were a personal sacrifice. I avoided eye contact, focused on my work, and reminded myself that engaging would only prolong something that didn't deserve attention. But there was a tension building that felt disproportionate to the situation, like pressure accumulating behind a locked door. The breaking point came on a Friday morning when the cafe was busier than usual, filled with overlapping conversations and the constant sound of cups clinking against saucers. And as I took my usual seat, I noticed her standing near the entrance, scanning the room with visible irritation. When she saw me, her expression hardened, and instead of ordering her drink, she walked straight toward my table with a determination that immediately set everyone nearby on edge. "This is ridiculous," she said loudly, drawing attention from multiple directions. "You can't just decide that a public cafe seat belongs to you." I closed my laptop slowly, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to signal that I was listening, and I asked her calmly what exactly the problem was. She responded by accusing me of deliberately occupying the same seat every day to keep others from using it. framing my routine as some kind of calculated act rather than a simple preference. When I explained, again, that I had never stopped anyone from sitting there and that the cafe was full of available seating, she laughed in a way that was entirely devoid of humor and said, "I've been watching you, and it's strange, and I don't feel comfortable." That word, strange, landed heavily because it transformed familiarity into suspicion, and before I could respond, she pulled out her phone and announced that she was calling the police. The cafe fell into an uneasy silence as she spoke loudly into her phone, describing me as someone who refused to move, who claimed the same spot every day, and who was making her feel unsafe. And as surreal as it sounded, I could feel the weight of her words settling over the room. I sat still, hands resting on the table, aware that every movement might be interpreted as something it wasn't. And for the first time since I'd started coming there, the cafe didn't feel like a neutral space anymore. When the police arrived, the contrast between expectation and reality was almost comical, because the officers stepped inside clearly anticipating a dispute of substance, only to be met with the sight of a man sitting quietly at a cafe table and a woman vibrating with indignation. She rushed toward them immediately, delivering her version of events with dramatic emphasis, pointing at me as if I were evidence rather than a person, while the rest of the cafe watched in a stunned, uncomfortable silence. One of the officers approached me and asked for my side of the story, and I explained, in measured detail, how long I'd been coming to the cafe, why I liked that seat, and how I had never told anyone they couldn't sit there. The officer listened carefully, then turned to the barista, who confirmed that I was a regular customer who had never caused any issues, and several patrons nearby nodded in agreement, quietly validating my account without making a spectacle of it. Karen, realizing that the narrative she constructed wasn't holding, shifted tactics, insisting that patterns of behavior could be threatening, and that she shouldn't have to feel uncomfortable in a public place. One of the officers responded gently but firmly, explaining that sitting in the same seat at a cafe was not illegal, suspicious, or grounds for police involvement, and that personal discomfort alone did not constitute harassment. The moment seemed to drain out of her all at once, replaced by a tight-lipped frustration that bordered on disbelief. And when it became clear that the police were not going to remove me or validate her accusations, she gathered her belongings abruptly and left without another word. The officers apologized to the staff for the disruption, reassured everyone that no laws had been broken, and exited the cafe, leaving behind a room full of people, trying to recalibrate after something so unnecessary and bizarre. I sat there for a while after that, staring at my coffee as it cooled, feeling a mix of relief, embarrassment, and anger that surprised me with its intensity, because it wasn't just about the seat anymore, but about how easily normal behavior can be reframed as a threat when someone decides their comfort matters more than someone else's presence. Eventually, I packed up my things and went to work, carrying the weight of the experience with me longer than I expected. In the days that followed, I kept returning to the cafe and sitting in the same seat, not out of defiance, but because routines are grounding, and surrendering them to someone else's entitlement felt like conceding a part of myself that I hadn't realized was vulnerable. Karen never returned during my usual hours, and the cafe slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. But the memory of that morning stayed with me as a quiet reminder of how fragile shared spaces can be. Now, when I sit by that window and watch the city wake up, I think about how many stories unfold unnoticed in ordinary places, how many conflicts begin not with malice, but with assumptions, and how important it is to stand calmly in your own normality, even when someone tries to turn it into something suspicious. It was never just a chair, but it was never more than a chair either. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply keep sitting where you belong.